Hello everyone. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about Bitcoin, which is a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. In this lecture, I'm going to introduce Bitcoin first. Then we're going to talk about the idea of distributed timestamp server that is used by the Bitcoin network. And we're going to see how the blockchain of Bitcoin is constructed, what's the content of each block. Uh, Specifically, I will talk about the way the header of a block is made. Also, we'll talk about proof of work uh, in Bitcoin network, and we'll see the definition of hash rate and how Moore's law affect the proof of work difficulty in um, Bitcoin network. At the end, I'll talk about the network protocol of Bitcoin and how um, the network goes through multiple steps one by one during its lifetime. So let's talk a little bit about how Bitcoin is different from other traditional cash systems and a little bit about the motivation of using Bitcoin. In a traditional cash system, when two parties, let's say A and B, want to exchange fund, they basically trust a third party, like a financial institution like F, and basically A sends the fund to the financial institution, and then F will forward the same fund to B, and this way A sends money to B, not directly, but with an intervention of a trusted third party. Now, Bitcoin wants to eliminate a trusted third party so that A and B can directly transfer fund. So let's say what Bitcoin wants to do is to make A send money directly to B without the intervention of any financial institution. That's a great idea. That's a very interesting idea. The problem is because A wants to send the electronic coin or some electronic cash to B, A can do some malicious activity and copy the same, let's say, coin and send a copy of that coin to another party, let's say C. This is called double spending. A uses the same coin um, to pay two parties, B and C. And we need to come up with a solution to the double spending problem if we want to create a purely peer-to-peer electronic cash system that does not rely on any trusted financial institution. To do this, the Bitcoin the Bitcoin uses a timestamp server. The network that Bitcoin has basically timestamps transactions by hashing them into an ongoing chain of hash-based proof of works, and that creates a record that cannot be changed over time without redoing the proof of work, which is a very complex and time-consuming and computationally complex process, and it makes it almost impossible to manipulate the past transactions, and that will create a solution to the double spending problem, because if you can accurately timestamp all the transactions, then there's a way for the payee, the party that wants to get the fine, to verify whether that fund has been spent before or not. So that's how Bitcoin solves the double spending problem and creates a peer-to-peer version of the traditional electronic cash system. So the Bitcoin network uses longest chain consensus algorithm and also uses proof of work for preventing Sybil attacks. Therefore, if the majority of CPU power is controlled by honest nodes, when I say majority, I mean 50% plus one. Then we can say with confidence that uh, the honest nodes can outpace the attackers and make the longest chain longer as time um, goes on, and this way the network gets resistant to any malicious activity, and the attackers who are not who are not in control of the majority of CPU power. And Bitcoin network is a great choice for a worldwide um, peer-to-peer cache system because it requires minimal structure for the network. What do I mean by that? The messages that are broadcast um, do not need to uh, get delivered for sure. They will be broadcast on a best effort basis, and if they get dropped for some reason, let's say because of network congestion, that's not the end of the world. And also, um, nodes doesn't the nodes involved in the network don't need to be always on, and they can leave and rejoin the network when they are not in the network, and they are, let's say, temporarily out of network. When they rejoin the network, they can accept the longest proof of work chain, because they know that the longest chain is controlled by the honest nodes, and that's how um, they can recover from their absence, and they can catch up to other nodes in the network. So in order to understand the Bitcoin network a little bit better, let's introduce the concept of electronic coin, which is basically a chain of digital signatures. Let's say you have a coin in the system. That coin can be generated by coin mining, or the process of proof of work, which we'll talk about it later. Let's say originally the coin is owned by owner zero, which I call it Alice. Let's say Alice wants to spend this coin by creating a transaction and sending it to another person, let's say Bob. So original owner zero is Alice. Now Alice wants to transfer the coin to Bob. How does Alice do it? Well, Alice has to acquire the owner one, the next owner's public key. Let's say this is Bob's public key, and it has to sign that piece of information so that it can generate a signature. That's part of the transaction of the coin to Bob, and then gives it to Bob. When Bob receives this transaction, Bob can verify Alice's signature, because everyone knows Alice's public key, so they can verify the signature. Now, Bob is the second owner of the coin. Let's call Bob owner number one. Now, Bob wants to spend this coin by sending it to Mary. Let's say Bob knows Mary's public key. Let's say this owner two is called Mary, and Mary's public key is right here. Bob will combine Mary's public key, which is the next the payee or the recipient of the transaction, along with concatenate that public key with the hash of the previous transaction, and it will sign them using his private key, and that would be Bob's signature. That can be verified by the next owner, who is Mary, as a genuine signature, because everyone knows Bob's public key. So when Mary receives this transaction, Mary can verify Bob's signature because Mary knows Bob's private key. So that, I'm sorry, because Mary knows Bob's public key can verify that. And then after Mary receives that coin, Mary can send it to another person. All Mary needs to do is to place the next person's public key in the transaction and hash it along with the previous transaction, and then sign it with her private key. So Mary will sign it with her private key, and that generates another transaction. Now that chain can go forwards, and that's how um, transactions look like. That's how a Bitcoin uh, can be exchanged between different parties. Uh, because of these digital signatures, everybody can verify the transactions, and there's no problem with authentication and verification. The problem that this model has is the double spending problem, which I explained it earlier. And in order to resolve that, we need to have a way to create reliable timestamps. That's why Bitcoin introduces or has introduced in 2008 a distributed timestamp server that basically timestamps and widely publishes the hash of the current block of transactions and all the previous blocks, which are summarized in the previous block. Um, and that forms a chain of blocks reinforcing the timestamps of previous blocks. And this way, as I said, it would be almost impossible for the attackers to manipulate a transaction's timestamp, because they have to go through the proof of works of all the blocks in that chain and redo all the proof of works, which is computationally impossible. So in order to append a new block of transactions to the timestamp server in the Bitcoin network, there are two possibilities. Either a central trusted authority should exist to propose a new block and append it to the chain of all blocks, or one of the peers should be selected through a system like a lottery or a competition um, that can add this a new block of transactions to the timestamp server. So let's say you have a number of transactions that have been recently made, but they have not been timestamped by the distributed server yet. So we need to combine them into one block, and let's say we should append that block to the longest chain of blocks that currently exist. So in order to do that, in order to append that new block, if we rely on a trusted third-party trusted authority, that's not possible, because we would like to, make the Bitcoin a pure P2P network without having to trust anyone. So that's not a good idea for Bitcoin, which is purely peer-to-peer. But the other idea is possible. That means one of the peers should be selected in a process to do this operation, to append the block to the timestamp server. That peer is selected by winning a lottery or a competition in which all peers may participate. So it's open to everyone. Everyone can participate in that lottery or competition, and if they win, they can append the block at the end of the longest chain. And in order to provide some incentive for the peers to participate in this lottery, the winner of the lottery will win a predetermined number of bitcoins, And that lottery is called proof of work, which we'll see the details in the next slide. And the reward rate of the lottery um, was originally 50 bitcoins in 2009, but the reward rate halves every 210,000 blocks. So that means about every 4 years, the um, the award, the reward rate gets half. Um, and uh, as an example, in 2012, the reward was 25 Bitcoin. In 2016, it was 12 and a half Bitcoin. And currently, from since 2020, the reward rate was 6.25 Bitcoins. And between 2009 and 2012, half of the coins got mined. Uh, Out of 21 million coins, um, 10 and a half millions of them have been mined. Uh, in From 2012 to 2016, 5.25 million of them have been mined. From 2016 to 2020, 2.63 million of them were mined. And as we go forward, uh, the reward rate will be exponentially less, and the number of remaining coins to be mined in the future uh, gets halved as well. And I should say the number of uh, new coins mined since the last halving um, will exponentially reduce as well. And if we do some quick analysis and extrapolation, we'll see that by the year 2040, we basically have all of the bitcoins in circulation, all the 21 million coins in circulation, and no more Bitcoin will be mined after the year 2040. And please remember that, because Bitcoin is purely peer-to-peer, the process of proof of work is basically a peer-to-peer way for circulating coins. After 2040, the network is not going to die. It basically um, survives or continues to live with the mined coins, but we will have no new coin after that year. So let's talk about the process of coin mining or proof of work in blockchain in Bitcoin network. So uh, let's say you have a Bitcoin peer called Miner who tries to solve the following puzzle. The puzzle looks like this. This is basically the lottery that I mentioned in the previous slide. Let's say you have a number of transactions that are going to be added to the network in a single block. So let's say the transactions are TX1, TX2, all the way to TXN, and these transactions are all have been verified. They're all valid transactions. All the signatures have been checked. Everything is okay. So these transactions are selected to be picked to be added to the network. And these transactions are normally picked from a pool of transactions. There are many transactions in a pool of transactions, but the miners like to pick transactions whose transaction fees are higher. Later I'll talk about transaction fee, but the idea is each transaction has a transaction fee, and if the transaction fee is higher, it is more uh, interesting for the miner to add that transaction to the block, to a new block, because the miner gets more incentives for transactions with higher fees. But anyways, we don't really want to talk too much about the way these transactions are selected. But let's say these transactions are selected for the by the miner to be added to the block to the Bitcoin, and uh, basically these transactions um, are going to be hashed using double SHA-256, and they can create a Merkle tree like this. Let's say we have 8 transactions. This is the first one, TA, second one, TB, TC, TD, TE, TF, TG, and TH. The first 2 transactions, TATB, have hash values HAHB. Let's say you're using one hash function like SHA-256, and the hash of um, transaction A and B will be combined and hashed again. This is the hash of AB. Same story happens with the hash of transactions C and D to create the hash of CD, and then the hash of transactions AB and hash of transactions CD will be combined and will be hashed again to create the hash of transactions A, B, C, and D, and that's the left-hand side of this Merkle tree. The same thing happens with transactions E, F, G, and H, and the root will be the hash of transactions E, F, G, H, and then these two hash values will be combined and will be hashed again to create the root of this Merkle tree. That root, we call it MR, which stands for Merkle root, and will be used as part of the proof of work, as part of the lottery, or the you can also call it the hard puzzle that should be solved by miners in order to add a new block to the blockchain of Bitcoin. And let's assume that pH represents the double SHA-256 hash value of the previous block in the chain of all blocks in the timestamp server. And also, let's say the miner choose a random number, let's call it nonce n, and that number is a 32-bit integer, and basically the miner, the peer in the Bitcoin, will find the double SHA-256 value of the combination of pH, MR, and N after concatenating them together, and that's going to give us a hash value which has 256 bit length. So the length of the result is 256 bits. Think of that as an unsigned integer and compare it with a threshold. We call that the threshold, or the tau, which specifies the level of difficulty of the puzzle. And if the result, if the hash value in the left hand side gets less than tau, then that means the node or the peer has won the lottery and can append the block of transactions to the chain of blocks, and can win the prize of the lottery, which is, as I said, 6.25 bitcoins. The highest possible target, which is possible to use, is this number, which we call it the pool difficulty. that's when you have the highest value possible here, that would be the easiest puzzle. The smaller tau gets, the more restrictive this condition will be, and the more difficult the puzzle will be. When I say it's more difficult, I mean it takes longer and it takes more computational power to solve it. And let's say if you halve the tau, then the complexity or the time to solve the puzzle will be doubled. And basically, as an example, let's say the threshold is this number, which is 404 CB times 2 to the power of 192. This is about 16.3 thousand times smaller than the original tau 0, which I showed you here, which was the pool difficulty 1. We call that we call the puzzle with this tau a puzzle with difficulty 16.3 times the pool difficulty 1, or 16,300 p diff, which stands for pool difficulty. And you can adjust the difficulty of puzzle by changing the value of tau. I'll tell you later why we need to change the difficulty of puzzle over time. So as I said in the previous slide, basically the miner, the peer who wants to solve the puzzle and participate in the lottery, basically picks the transactions that are going to be added to a block and checks whether those transactions are valid. If some of them are not valid, it's going to update its choices of transactions and try again. If it picks all the valid transactions, or picks not all the valid transactions, but it picks the transactions that are all valid, then it starts the mining process by picking a nonce, a random number, and computing the hash value that I showed you in the previous slide. If the hash value is less than threshold, then the mining process is over. Otherwise, it has to adjust nonce. Normally, they pick the next nonce, or nonce plus plus, or nonce plus one for the next round, and they keep calculating the hash values of multiple different nonces until one of them give a hash value less than threshold, and that means if they get the hash value less than threshold, that means the block has been mined properly and the mining process is over. They have to propagate the block to everyone. They have to publicly announce that they have solved the proof of work, and they have found the solution to proof of work puzzle. And when others, the peers of the miner, receive the propagated block, which looks like this, they look at the header of the block, and they see the previous hash, the previous block's hash in it. They will see the transactions and also the Merkle root, which I said that would be basically the hash of all transactions in the block. And they see the nonce that has been calculated by the miner, and that's the solution of the proof of work puzzle. And they see if that block is valid. How do they do that? Basically, in order to find out whether the new block is valid or not, they first check all the transactions in it. If all the transactions in that block are valid, then they calculate the hash value. If the hash value is less than threshold, they will find out that in fact the block is valid, and they will add it uh, uh, to the list of blocks that the chain of blocks that they preserve. And if the hash value is not less than threshold, then they're going to reject it, and they're going to discard the proposed block. And because everyone can verify the solution of proof of work puzzle, and there would be no disagreement, and everybody will be in consensus by saying accept, this is a correct block, or reject, this is not a correct block. So as we saw, the proof of work in Bitcoin network basically can propose a way to uh, add a new block or append a new block to the longest chain. And as we discussed, um, solving the proof of work puzzle is a very time consuming and computationally heavy process, and that basically um, means the longest chain um, has an investment of the greatest computational effort by many nodes uh, to do the proof of work and create that longest chain, and that makes it almost impossible for the attackers uh, uh, to um, to attack and ruin or destroy the previous records stored in the timestamp server. Now, the problem that we have with proof of work, or the challenge that exists in the proof of work of blockchain, is that based on the Moore's law, the speed of computer hardware increases exponentially over time. That means, let's say, every 18 months or every 24 months, or any like every um, couple of years, the number of transistors in computer hardware get doubled, and that will create an exponential speed on the exponential growth in the speed of computers and the speed of CPUs. And if we keep the difficulty of proof of work puzzle constant over time, then block generation rate becomes too fast over time. If you remember, we wanted to keep the block generation at a constant pace of about 10 minutes per block. This way we can add coins slowly to the market, and basically distribute the coins and put them in circulation slowly over time until, let's say, 2040 or something. But if we don't change the difficulty of proof of work in long term, uh, you know, all the the coin mining rates will increase and become so fast that all the coins can get mined within a short period of time. In order to avoid that, and in order to tackle the challenge proposed by the Moore's law, what we can do is to adjust the difficulty of proof of work every 2 weeks, or to be more exact, every 2016 blocks. Um, uh, we can, adjust the difficulty of proof of work and coin mining by, if we want to adjust it and increase the difficulty, we have to lower the value of tau, which was the threshold. If we want to make it easier, we have to increase the tau. But generally, we want to make it more difficult because the technology always advances and the speed of computer gets faster. So every 2 weeks, we look back and see if um, or every 2016 blocks that are generated, we look back and see if the blocks are generated in a appropriate time. If they are generated too fast, we're gonna make the proof of work a bit um, harder. If they are generated too slowly, we're gonna make the proof of work a bit easier. And this plot shows you the level of difficulty of proof of work over time in 2012 and 2013. You see the red plot, and as you see, the red plot is adjusted because you know the speed of computers been grown exponentially over time, or have grown exponentially over time. Basically, the other plots, other than the red one, the other plots that you see show the hash rate over time. The hash rate, as you see here, it says tera hash rate per second. Hash rate is basically defined in the following way: the number of double SHA-256 computations that can be performed in 1 second in the Bitcoin network by all the nodes involved in the Bitcoin network. Of course, that's a great measurement unit of computational power of the nodes and computers involved in the network. The higher the hash rate is, the greater the computational complexity, the computational power of nodes will be, and the greater those are, the greater computational power is, the easier they can solve proof of work. So we need to make the proof of work more difficult so that we can control and slow down the blockchain, the block generation rate. So let's summarize what we have learned so far about the Bitcoin network by reviewing the steps that the nodes in the network should follow. First, some new transactions are broadcast to all nodes over time, basically because the network is alive and people want to exchange funds, they create new transactions, and the new transactions are broadcast to all nodes, and nodes will keep a pool of new transactions. Each node basically pick some transaction from that pool to collect a block of new transactions, and after that the node works on finding a difficult proof of work for the proposed block. If the node can solve the proof of work, when the node finds the proof of work, it broadcasts the block to all nodes. In the next step, nodes will accept the block only if all transactions are valid and they're not already spent, because that would be double spending and it's not allowed. And basically, after this step, node should accept the block, right? Because if everything is fine and all transactions are valid and the proof of work has been done correctly by the proposed block, they should add it to the block. They should add it to the network, to the chain of blocks, and they do this. But instead of explicitly acknowledge the acceptance of the block, they work on creating the next block in the chain using the hash of the accepted block as the previous hash. So this way, they will implicitly accept the block, because if they did not accept the block, they wouldn't consider the hash of that block as a previous hash. And that basically means they have accepted this block and they are working to mine the next block. And this way you don't need any explicit acknowledgement, like the way, let's say, TCP provides an explicit acknowledgement. Here we don't explicitly acknowledge, and that will help the simplicity of the blockchain network. I'm sorry, the Bitcoin network. As I said, Bitcoin network is very simple, and it's a great tool for implementing the peer-to-peer widespread international um, caching system. Finally, you can see my only reference, which is the main Bitcoin paper written by Satoshi Nakamoto.